Welcome, everyone. I'm Chris Miller, the Eurasia Director at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and delighted to have you join us today for a discussion on the political situation in Belarus, now approaching nearly a month after the fraudulent presidential election there and the subsequent protests. We're very lucky today to have again join us Katia Glod to discuss events in Minsk and how they fit into broader European security and political questions. Katia was just in Minsk until quite recently, now back in London, but back with us today to give us her sense of how the protests are developing, how politics within the regime in Minsk are developing, and how this relates to relations between Russia and the West more generally. Katia is an expert in Belarusian politics, among many, many other things, and a non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy and Analysis. And there's no better person that I can think of to help us understand what's happened over the past couple of weeks since we last spoke. So, Katia, could you start by giving us an update on what's changed in the past couple of weeks? We know there's mass protests after the elections. Now we're several weeks into them. What is the current status of events in Minsk?
Yes, sure. Well, hello, everyone. And thank you very much, Chris, for the introduction and for this opportunity to speak again about Belarus. It's very important to keep this country in focus. And I am really happy I can share my insights coming from Belarus literally 2 days ago. Well, indeed, we have seen almost a month after the election, and we have seen several weeks of protests. We cannot say that the protest is diminishing in any way. On the contrary, during the last few protests that were held on Sundays, we saw actually more people joining in. These protests are very much peaceful protests. They focus on soft power, on women. Also, they give rise to many other civil actions and activities. Such as, for example, student protests, singing of unofficial Belarusian anthems in shopping centers, at the railway station, at the market. We have seen also many letters from various so-called labor collectives, from various companies and public institutions addressing their management and higher up authorities demanding the resignation of Lukashenko and free and fair elections. We have seen efforts such as, for example, to recall the MPs who fail to advocate the rights of people and who fail to speak up against the violence and the rigged elections. And of course, we have seen massive, very grassroots level, very grassroots efforts of people to put up white, red, white flags, to stand in solidarity chains, to protect memorials in memory of those who were killed during the protests, as well as some symbolic memorials, such as, for example, the one dedicated to the two DJs who put on a protest song during a government event. So all that has been quite positive. However, we have not seen really a proper national strike, as had been hoped at some point. At the moment, I can say that there is not a single company that is actually striking, not to mention a whole national strike. Probably the closest company that came to the strike is the Belarus Kali, the National Potash Company, and currently some of their divisions are working at a lower capacity than normal, and they assess that they will probably come out at about 60 or 70% output of their normal production by the end of the month. But that's really the only company that has been striking. Why other companies are not striking? There are several reasons for that. Obviously, the repression is very high. We have seen unprecedented level of repression recently, targeting all layers of society, including workers. There have been arrests of many members of the striking committees at different companies, state-owned companies and factories. We have seen intimidation of them. Some of them have fled the country. Some of them have been detained by the KGB. And we also have seen a very difficult legal situation in the way that Again, I mean, we have to realize how strong this regime is, that when Lukashenko came to power, not only did he put the independent trade union under the state control, also the labor code was revised to the extent that you cannot actually strike on political grounds. It has to be only economic demands. You have to put your striking letter in a very complex legal way, and many people lacked that expertise. Now it's a bit mediated by help from the lawyers of the United headquarters. But nonetheless, I mean, it's still very difficult in terms of repression and in terms of the legal procedures to organize a national strike. And not least, the main issue, of course, that we forget is that the opposition, be it political parties, NGOs, or free trade union, have been for 26 years basically persecuted, prosecuted, and suppressed in Belarus. And we came to the situation when there are no institutions and no structures in place, and they had not been in place. 2010, another year of the presidential election, was a year when, which gave another big blow to the structures. And at the end of the day, we came to the situation when we had people protesting, we had workers protesting, but there were no structures who could very quickly seize this momentum, organize a national strike, organize a national protest, and put forward their demands. And that's why I think, unfortunately, that's why, you know, that's why we did not see any change, any political change in the week following the election day, even though there were some feelings that Belarus was at a tipping point. And obviously, as I said, again, coming back to the repression, level of repression, I would like to underline that this is exceptionally high. I think over, you know, all my years that I have spent in Belarus living, I think that was the first time when I felt personally myself quite uncomfortable. You can't even compare it to 2010. You have this repression, which is, you basically is hanging in the air. You go with your child to a park, you see this military vans which were used to basically grab people from the streets, put them into and drag them to the prisons. You see these vans everywhere in the park. You see lots of vans of the security services which don't have number plates, and they're everywhere. They just enter you know, your everyday life. This is just to describe how, you know, psychologically it feels. But obviously we have very concrete targeted repression. And again, it goes through many different professions and layers of society. We have seen leading doctors being sacked, such as, for example, the head of the cardiological hospital. A leading specialist in heart surgery in Belarus was sacked, even though people gave him a 4-minute applaud when the new Minister of Health tried to sack him, and the only reason was that his hospital was obviously very active during the anti-violence protests. We have seen several chancellors of universities being sacked. I mentioned already the repression against the workers. The coordinating council of the opposition, which has been recently set up to help for the power transition, has also seen unprecedented level of repression. The last example being a famous lawyer, mediator lawyer, who was a few days ago arrested by the KGB, and she's now facing criminal charges for tax evasion. And all other important members of this coordinating council have been interrogated by the investigative committee, as indeed we have seen even with the Nobel literature laureate Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. We have seen, obviously, teachers at the university level are also being targeted, those who were against the violence and those who spoke up against the rigged elections. I have friends working at the university who recently reports that they have received unprecedented instructions from their managers, superiors, saying that all of them will now have to face a so-called professional competence test, and this is that never was the case, but obviously all teachers, university professors understand that this is linked to recent Lukashenko statements that those teachers who do not follow the state ideology should leave the educational establishments. And on the 1st of September, Lukashenko also mentioned that they are planning to adopt a new educational code. So repression runs at all levels. It obviously puts a very chilling effect on protesters. Even though as I say, we still see very big numbers, that might change with obviously the weather getting a bit worse. At the same time, I don't think that they will completely evaporate. Protest might take a different format, but once there is a call again for a big Sunday protest, I think it will be quite easy to bring people to the streets. At the same time, again, we're seeing more and more young people in this protest rather than the initial ones. They were attended by many different ages. Perhaps I should say a couple of words about the opposition. I mentioned that the opposition had been persecuted and prosecuted in the past, and we are now seeing obviously the same happening after this election, only on a much higher level. At the same time, we are seeing certain attempts to make different institutions, to set up different structures, and we are seeing some, I guess, inevitable splits within the opposition, which basically we have now three centers of the opposition groupings. We have Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is in Vilnius, and all her team who were in her own campaign, not Kolesnikova, not Tsepkala, but her own workers. They all immigrated to Vilnius at the moment. They are very much working on the international arena. Then we have in Minsk itself, we have the coordinating council. Its presidium is made up of about 20 people, led by Mrs. Kolesnikova, the head of Babarika's campaign, and Mr. Latushka, the former ambassador and minister of culture, who left, who was sacked from the National Theatre of Belarus. He is also a very charismatic leading figure. And then we see Nechta, who is a blogger, very intelligent young man, very impressive, and he has, in my view, the highest potential for organizing people, and perhaps he's done one of the largest amounts of work recently. And he sits in Warsaw, and he and his team, I think there are about 4 people, but they're planning to expand. He's the one who is sending messages on Telegram, asking people to protest, and he's been the driving force behind the protesters. And in terms of the achievements of the current protest, again, we have not really seen so far any cracks in the elites, in the ruling elites. We have seen some low-level defections and some ambassadors quitting. We have seen some members of the law enforcement quitting. We have seen one mayor of Grodno who took the side of the protesters, but was very quickly replaced. The mayor, not of Grodno city itself, but of Grodno Oblast, I mean. And so basically we still have this very, very monolithic state apparatus in place, which is not showing any any cracks yet. And again, we should, why is it so? Well, because we should not forget that that was constructed very carefully by Lukashenko and the presidential administration over the 26 years. It runs, again, from the very bottom of the village executive authority all the way up to the presidential administration. We have so-called ideological workers put in place at every state company, at every public institution. And even if these people do not share views of the Lukashenko or of the current regime, they all have, you know, financial rents, financial benefits that they can reap from the regime. And B, they still, in my view, they basically they think about this moment, and they're not really thinking about the future, and then they basically implement the orders which had been given to them, again, because they don't see a mass. They don't really think that, you know, protesters can achieve something, and therefore, at the moment, for them, it's better and still quite convenient to back up the regime. So therefore, as far as the protests are concerned, we can only say that what has been achieved is this symbolic occupation of space, that people at least can do various solidarity chains, can come to the main square in the evening, sing songs. We have not really seen much violence, but that would be also not quite true, perhaps. I mean, we do see a lot of the smaller rallies, smaller protests being dispersed by the riot police. Indeed, the violence is not on such scale, but it's more kind of Moscow style, you know, trying to grab certain people in a quite violent way, including students, but not touch everyone. We have not seen any violence on Sundays, which is also some achievement. And obviously, everyone is quite amused by all those very witty and clever slogans and posters that protesters have been carried. And that's quite liked by the people, because they see it as a way to overcome their fear, and also as a way to desacralize this very authoritarian, very cruel regime. And I see it very much in line with the Serbian Otpor, when their goal was to through laughter, to desacralize the regime of Milosevic. And I think that's what Nechta and people, younger people, that's what they're doing. And that's obviously have had an effect. And having now 3 Sundays of big rallies, I think that this fear of being violently assaulted, it's slightly subsiding, which is also positive, because we can see more people drawn into the protests. So maybe
Katia, could I jump in there with a question about the strategies of the opposition? And as you mentioned, there are different groups in the opposition and the regime. On the one hand, as you said, the regime looks like it's decided not to use large-scale violence against the protesters, or at least thus far it's made that decision. So it's going to try to wait out the protests and I guess hope that they dissipate as the weather gets colder, or if they don't make any progress. What's the opposition strategy? They've gotten mass street protests numerous times, as you've said. They've made this effort to delegitimize the regime in the eyes of the people of Belarus. What's their longer term strategy, given that they haven't been able to push Lukashenko out yet? What additional steps can they take?
Yes, yeah, well, speaking frankly, I don't think they have come up with a strategy at the moment. And that's where the major drawback is. I think it's a matter of, you know, trial and error. And this is what they're trying now. They're trying various formats. Nechta, the blogger who sits in Poland, his strategy is clearly to try to push people to the streets, to try to erode the regime basis as much as possible. For example, he has been coming up with various ideas of how people can, for example, economically attack this regime, not to buy products, you know, by certain Lukashenko's oligarchs, try to take your money out of Belarusian banks, not to pay your utility bills. And obviously, he's also asking people to protest. Yesterday, on the 1st of September, when it's the start of the academic year in Belarus, he called on students to take to the streets. We did see some student strikes and some protests, but it was altogether not very much. I mean, about 2% of all students in Belarus actually did follow him. So I think the strategy of Nechta, of this blogger, is more along the lines of the Serbian Otpor, to try to draw in as many people as possible into the protests, to desacralize the regime, to attack the regime from various sides, like economically, through pressure on, through social context, through pressure on those who still maybe not voluntarily, but nonetheless support the regime, and by staging some resistance. So I think Nechta's strategy is more or less clear, but when it comes to the proper political opposition, well, because they are quite inexperienced, they are new people, they managed to rally support behind Tikhanovskaya, but now, as I said, Tikhanovskaya is a bit out of the process. And now we see several defections, that everyone in a way in the opposition is doing their own thing. Tikhanovskaya is saying that, there should be that she is a national leader, and that, she calls on people to some extent to protest as well, but she's more focusing now on the international arena, on making speeches. Then we have this coordinating council, which I think was taken a little bit aback and was quite bewildered by this current repression targeted personally at them, when all of them are being called into an investigative committee to be interrogated. I don't think they expected that, and therefore I think they're currently lost and confused, and they're trying to think of a new strategy. We also, as I said, we have, quite different people there, that basically the presidium consists of experts. And for example, I would see that maybe they create some sort of, shadow cabinets, that, they would select a person representing Minister of Interior, Ministry of Economy, and they would be creating positive agenda, positive proposals, and commenting publicly on the proposals of the government. But I think they don't have so much coordination between themselves. For example, Pavel Latushka, he called on people to organize a public movement, but that was just, more a rhetorical call. I don't think he followed up on that with the procedural side. And then we have the council, other members of the council who represent Babarika headquarters. Babarika is the ex-banker who is currently in prison, but who was one of the strongest, or if not the strongest, potential candidates in this election. And the other day, Miss Kolesnikova, who represents Babarika, she said that they would like to create a party, and they broadcast a video which was recorded by Mr. Babarika before he was jailed at the end of June. And that was met with some opposition and antagonism from the public, because the public was a bit also confused and lost, and they thought that it would be spending more valuable time on bureaucratic procedures, on collecting papers, on trying to apply for party registration, even though for the past 10 years there have been no opposition political parties registered in Belarus. But I think their position was more drawn by the fact that there are some Babarika supporters, and they want to represent something bigger than just Babarika sitting in prison. They have certain interests, they have an agenda, and again, they want to have more representation. They want to try to consolidate and build the structure, which would be possible perhaps to use later in communication with the regime, because currently the regime does not recognize the opposition council at all. So we don't really have a united strategy. I hope that these factions still somehow talk to each other, or at least the political opposition, Tikhanovskaya, and the coordinating council will come up with a strategy. At least what is positive, that so far we don't see any of that infighting that had always characterized the older type opposition. In public, they're still very respectful towards each other. So basically, in a way, I think it's inevitable that they're splitting up, but obviously they have to put more thinking into a strategy.
We've had a couple of questions come in from the audience, and I encourage anyone listening to type questions into the Q&A box, and I'll try to pick them up if we haven't answered them already. One question about the role of Russia in these events. Obviously, the Russian government has been vocally supportive of Lukashenko. Can you talk us through how Russia is affecting the situation?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. That's one issue, one very important issue that we have not touched. Well, I guess the role of Russia has been as predicted, although I think it was taken a bit as a disappointment by the Belarusian public, who has tried to insist that the protest is not, this revolution in Belarus is not about the geopolitics, it's not about choosing between Russia and the West, it's about being able to elect your own government. But nonetheless, so far, Russia has clearly taken up the role to support Lukashenko, at least give him moral support. Whereas, of course, at a later point, it might stop this support and decide to support someone else. But this someone else obviously won't be Tikhanovskaya or any candidate who would be elected by, let's say, by the people or chosen by the people. As Russia likes to do things, it will be someone a person who should be decided within the regimes themselves, and a person who will have much closer ties to the elites than Tikhanovskaya, who is a popular leader, is. So if so far Russia has, let's say, avoided direct military intervention, the covert intervention of Russia is very much evident and is very much taking place, starting from the Russia propaganda. Russian propaganda agents, in a way, green men who have come in Belarus in the form of Russian propaganda TV people. When Belarusian members of the Belarusian television national company, mainly technical staff who decided to quit the television and support the protesters, Lukashenko asked for help, and we saw people from Russia Today coming. We saw these people we see them not only at every rally, but we see them a lot in basically preparing content for the Belarusian television. And now the official narrative that we're seeing from the Belarusian broadcast media is very antagonistic and very much along the same line of Russia Today, and it repeats this very strong anti-popular revolution negative. We have seen this very same political technologies being brought again from Russia in terms of organizing rally in support of Lukashenko, as they are called Putin-looking rallies, playing on the words rally meeting in Russian. And we can see this rally staged by the government everywhere. Yesterday they were protesting in front of the Polish embassy and Lithuanian embassy. We see cars with red and green flags being driven by them. So in other words, we see very clear role of Russia in the current post-election aftermath. And in my view, what Russia wants currently, I mean, obviously, it cannot accept a popular revolution in Belarus. Obviously, Tikhanovskaya or any other, as I said, leader would not be acceptable from the same background. They perhaps would not mind for someone pro-Russian who could replace Lukashenko, but currently there isn't really such a figure in Belarus that can be easily noticed. And on the other hand, I think that they will obviously try to make the regime of Lukashenko very weak, very financially and economically dependent on Russia, and we can even call it a soft or creeping annexation. You don't need really to have, you don't need to have formal boundaries, but you can have the case of, Abkhazia or Transnistria, which are parts of the same country, but nonetheless the Lukashenko or the leader is not really a leader in the full sense of the word, but is a Russian puppet. And I fear that this is what we might see in happening in Belarus. And lastly, on this, I would like to mention that there is also another aspect of that, of a more formal, if you wish, integration of Belarus. We have today, there is a visit of the Russian Prime Minister Mishustin in Minsk. And there have already been made statements this morning about Russia forgiving the big gas debt to Belarus and also agreeing on the new energy price. There is also a visit of the Belarusian Minister of Defense scheduled to Russia, and obviously in around 10th or 14th of September, as it's speculated, there is a meeting planned between Putin and Lukashenko, and Russian analysts in particular like to notice that this is probably, when Lukashenko will be signing in the famous 31st integration map between Belarus and Russia, meaning that agreeing to the national, to one single currency, or to the incorporation of the tax system. Obviously, all that is more along, conspiracy lines. It remains to be seen, but there is definitely very clear engagement from the side of Russia in the current political situation in Belarus, which my last point of that is actually pushing the Belarusian public against Russia as such and against Putin. And today, for the first time, we saw the first rally, small rally in one of the Minsk neighborhoods with the posters and slogans, Putin, who are you for? And we don't want to be another Russian oblast. And this is, we are clearly seeing a potential trend of this protest becoming also geopolitical, when people see the support by the Baltic states forming solidarity chains, and versus they see the reaction of Putin and the Russian government. Obviously, that all pushes people to make and articulate their choices.
Is there any chance that if Lukashenko is pressured to conduct more integration agreements, if you will, with Russia, surrender sovereignty over different parts of Belarus's governance, that might lead to a new set of divisions within the elite, that some elites will say we prefer Belarusian sovereignty to the continuation of Lukashenko's rule?
Yes, it's possible, although at the moment we have seen no signs of the Belarusian elites backing up openly backing up the independence of Belarus or the sovereignty of Belarus. On the contrary, we have seen, for example, yesterday, Foreign Minister Mackay, who spoke with Lavrov and gave a press conference where he thanked Lavrov and Russia for their help, and where he spoke quite negatively about the Western countries, which is basically, was also picked up by other members of the elites, like the Minister of Defense, etc. So at the moment, we don't see any signs that Belarusian elite is prepared to stand up for sovereignty. Of course, it might still mean that people in the ruling elites think that they're a bit playing with fire, but it will not go as far as any further integration. But that's, an open-ended question. Certainly within the Belarusian ruling elite, there are younger people, like even Lukashenko's own son, Viktor, who have been grown up during the independent time of Belarus, and they can't imagine these people wanting to be part of Russia. So it remains to be seen if they stand up at a later stage, but at the moment there aren't any signs of that.
One question from the audience about the response of religious leaders to the protests and the repression. Could you talk about the role of both the church in Belarus and also maybe the Russian Orthodox Church in these protests?
Yes, of course. There are two main churches in Belarus. One is the Belarusian Church of the Russian Orthodox Church. Belarus does not have its independent Orthodox Church, so it's ruled from Moscow. And the other big part is the Catholic Church. They have, surprisingly, they have both been quite vocal about the post-election violence. Even the Russian patriarch, he spoke up against violence. He also said that he was too quick to congratulate Lukashenko on his victory, because indeed at first he congratulated Lukashenko on his victory in the current elections. And the Russian Patriarch Pavel was also the one who visited those people who were tortured in prisons. He visited them in hospitals, and they organized several masses praying for the health of people who were beaten up. And immediately we saw that this patriarch was replaced by a new patriarch, by the Russian Church, by the Russian Orthodox Church. For the first time, the new patriarch, he is actually a Belarusian. Until this time, all the other patriarchs, heads of Belarusian branch of the Russian Orthodox Church, they were Russians. So therefore, there has been a mixed view on his role. He's definitely, he hasn't been so outspoken so far, but he has not done anything supporting Lukashenko or the regime proactively. And of course, when we go to the Catholic Church, that role was a bit even quite more, I would say, profound in supporting the protesters. The head of the Catholic Church in Belarus, Kondrasevich, who was recently not allowed in Belarus, even though this is fully illegal as he is a citizen of Belarus, but currently he's not able to come back to Minsk. He was in Poland and still is in Poland. The Catholic Church actively spoke up against the violence as well as did the Russian Church. The Catholic Church also said that those people with the different views and those who demonstrate dissent, they should be respected and they should not be called names, as had been done by the regime. And at several rallies, particularly, for example, I was on the rally, was participating in the rally on the 23rd of August, and a big part of the rally was passing through the main Catholic cathedral, and all the time that people were passing by this church, the main Catholic church, the bells were ringing, and several priests came out with the victory sign, and they were standing outside openly showing their support. So the role of the church, I would say, has been more positive this time. And some analysts in Belarus thought that perhaps the church could play this mediating role in the current political stalemate, and it would be one of those sides that, you know, could participate in the dialogue between the opposition and the regime. But about a week ago, Lukashenko said that basically the priests should go back to their business. They should not interfere into the politics. And therefore, in my view, we speak about the role of the church in mediating the crisis. I don't think that it's realistic that church could play such a role, because it's not really, I don't think that this regime will accept this.
We've had a couple questions on the role of the West's response. It seems like Poland and Lithuania have in some ways been leading the response of the European Union. I'd be interested to hear your assessment both of what the West should do, and also are there any risks of tying the West too closely to the opposition and further making this a divide along geopolitical lines, not only on domestic political lines?
Yes, yeah, thank you. That's also a very, very important question. And the role of the West so far has been positive. We take into consideration, particularly the neighboring countries. They have been showing a lot of moral support. They have also implemented sanctions against the regime of Lukashenko. They have also offered concrete financial support to the victims of repression. And they are also prepared to show further solidarity. There have been videos from, for example, Polish civil society actors supporting Belarus, and all that has been taken very positively by the Belarusian public. And I think they're very thankful, and they feel stronger, obviously, from the support. I think it was very positive to hear that the European Union will take targeted sanctions. In my view, targeted sanctions actually are a very good tool, and they should be used on a rather wide scale. I think currently the expectation is that there will be 17 top-level officials on the list of those sanctioned, and in the view of, I think, of many in Belarus, this list should be expanded. It should include all, for example, all members of the election commissions who were involved in electoral fraud, including members of their families, all members of the riot police, because the only reasoning behind that is, as people know in Belarus, that many of these members of the elections commissions, teachers, or who they are, as well as riot police, they all love to travel to Vilnius and shop there or have fun or go to Poland. And if there was this deterrent that they were not able to enter the European Union, that would actually put many of them off violence or electoral fraud. The other thing is also what is important. I think the West, on the contrary, should step up its support of Belarus in terms of moral support, in terms of speaking up against Russia's involvement, because so far we've seen that Russia has been very active and the West has been quite timid in terms of trying not to upset Russia, being afraid not to trigger a military aggression in Belarus. But I think we come to the point when it is becoming geopolitical, and I think I see more and more people in Belarus now turning more towards the West. And I think eventually, if this stalemate is going to continue for some time, which is likely to, I think it will to some extent inevitably become geopolitical. And the West will have to take a stronger position and stronger criticism of Russia. Obviously, Merkel and Macron spoke to Putin against military intervention, and perhaps they also mentioned that there should not be any covert intervention, what we are currently seeing as well. So in my view, there should be a stronger position of the EU also in terms of telling Russia that either there will be strong sanctions against Russia if Russia continues also its covert intervention in Belarus through the propaganda, through supporting Lukashenko at the state level, through discrediting the opposition, as Lavrov did yesterday, basically casting slayers against Tikhanovskaya and the members of the coordinating council. So yeah, in my view, all that should be also taken into account, and Russia should be either threatened with sanctions, or on the contrary, perhaps offered a carrot, of normalizing the relations with the West, if it does not intervene into Belarus covertly, or if it mediates a dialogue with the wider opposition.
And do you see the United States playing a meaningful role in this process, or is this primarily a question of what the European Union decides to do?
Yes, that's one point which I forgot to mention. We have not really seen a great engagement from the US, which actually I think disappointed quite a lot of people in Belarus. Obviously, the US is focused on its own election, and at the same time, before obviously the US was the driving force behind sanctions, we have seen a statement recently of Mike Pompeo, we have seen a statement of Mr. Bigon the other day, but these are still statements, and obviously if the US joins the EU with the sanctions, that would be very, I think that would be quite a good step forward. And Lukashenko is actually, I said that before, I think he's more fearful of the US reaction than the European Union reaction, because he understands all the friction within the European Union, and he understands the power of the US. So I think there should definitely be joint front, the US and the EU together, and the US needs to step up its pressure against the regime of Lukashenko.
We've also had a couple of questions about the role that China might be playing, if any, in the protests or in supporting the regime in its response to the protests. Obviously, China has talked about Belarus as an important part of the Belt and Road in Europe. Does China matter when it comes to politics in Belarus right now?
It's a very interesting question. At the moment, we have not seen any direct or indirect intervention by China. There have not been any statements, well, apart from congratulating Lukashenko on his victory, obviously. I can see the role of China more in the economic aspects of that. And this is something that perhaps we also need to bring into the discussion, that one of the triggers of a bigger protest perhaps would be the economic deterioration, which we expect to see very soon. We have already seen certain problems with the Belarusian currency. The ruble has been depreciating. It has stabilized a bit, but it's very likely again to go down. Because there is this profound lack of public trust into the state institutions, including towards the national bank or towards the national currency. And apart from that, obviously, Belarusian economic model is not sustainable. It needs market reform, and without market reform, it needs constant cash injections. And currently, obviously, the West is not going to be one who will be giving loans to Belarus. It has not given recently, over the past few years, big loans anyways, because Belarus was not implementing the agreed reforms. So Belarus can only come either turn to Russia or turn to China. I think a month ago there was a statement that Belarus received about $500 million from China as a direct loan. Usually Chinese loans, they are tied up to particular projects that China is doing, and China is investing in Belarus. Obviously, the investment is lower than the one of Russia, but it's higher than Western investment. So China might play basically a role of a banker who would give money to the regime if in several months' time the regime will find that it can't meet the ends, and if the financial crisis deteriorates. And currently we have seen already certain signs of it in the Belarusian banking sector. So if China does give some loans, that would obviously prop up the regime. But that remains to be seen, because I think China also obviously considers its own interest, and that's the first time that it gave direct loan without it being tied up to the project. It's not very well, we can't say whether it's likely or not, but it's not kind of the pattern that China has been applying to Belarus so far.
And does that imply, therefore, that as Belarus needs more funds, needs more loans from abroad, Russia is their only option, and is Russia willing to subsidize the Belarusian economy further? Obviously, there's been talk in Russia about cutting off Belarus from certain energy subsidies, and now it looks like we might be heading back in the opposite direction. Is that an accurate interpretation?
Yes, yeah. Well, Russia has been giving support to Belarus through several channels, through energy prices, cheap energy prices on oil and on natural gas. Belarusian companies, state-owned companies, they consume a lot of gas, and that has been a big support to Belarus, but also through direct loans. However, over the past, almost over the entire 2019, Russia hasn't been given. Since then, Russia hasn't given any loans to Belarus, and now this conversation, there is now a new talk about also Russia giving $1 billion to Belarus, which is currently peanuts because the gap is much bigger. It's about $4 billion that Belarus needs every year to refinance its foreign debt, which is almost all denominated in dollars, and also to support the fallen economy. It's very likely, of course, that that Russia would try to use that as a bargain and would try to use it as a leverage to pressure Lukashenko. because currently Lukashenko lost all support from the West. He is not considered as a legitimate president. Obviously, yes, his only channel is either Russia or China. If Russia gives money, it will definitely be at the expense of something. Either Belarus becomes a de facto sort of part of Russia, retaining, some formal authority, but at the same time, Lukashenko is a puppet governor who is completely ruled from Moscow. This is quite likely. Or there is another option that Russian business interests would like to tap into Belarusian state-owned companies. Belarus Kali, the potash company, has been always very interesting to Russia. The two refineries, one of it is privatized. There are private shares, and there is some interest, some Russian interest in it. However, the other one is still fully state-owned. Obviously, Russia is also very much interested in Belarusian engineering, heavy machine factories, like those that create, trucks for mining trucks and similar equipment. For example, Belarus and Mars, two Belarusian state-owned automobile or trucks companies, they take about 40% each of the Russian market. And obviously, Russia is very interested in the Belarusian MZKT plant, which is the factory that produces chassis for the Russian military equipment, for Russian missile systems. And Russia still so far has not been able to build something similar. Their Kamaz company has been trying, has been putting efforts into that, but they have not gone yet that far to replace Belarusian chassis completely, and the Belarusian ones still are considered to be the best. So Russia would definitely be very happy to tap into that company as well. And these might be all the things that will be put on the agenda for Lukashenko that he will have to give access to if Russia props him up financially.
One question from the audience referenced the Belarusian IT industry, which is obviously much more independent from the state. How do you see the future of that industry if the current status quo remains in place?
Yes, that's also an excellent question, and I could direct you to two articles which have been written very recently. Actually, they came out yesterday. One is in the Financial Times, and the other one is in Moscow Times, exactly describing the effects and the potential consequences for the IT sector. I myself have several friends working in the IT sector. So what I can say is that the IT sector has put a lot into these elections. They had invested many of their resources. They had created this alternative platform for alternative vote count. They have been, after the elections, they have been putting a lot of money into setting up various initiatives to help the victims of repression. They have been, IT people have been at the forefront of the protests. You can see their solidarity chains every day at the outskirts of Minsk, where the high-tech park is located. Obviously, the IT people are also those for whom it's very easy to relocate. Because they just need basically their laptop and they can go. I think the figures that have been surfacing recently were, for example, there was a statement by the head of the Ukrainian Association of IT engineers saying that his industrial group received applications from 350 IT people in Belarus who would like to relocate to Ukraine. Now, he said that only 10% of these people actually are thinking about permanent relocation, implying that 90% of people would come back. I think recently, today, there were some figures about 21 companies, IT Belarusian companies, willing to relocate to Lithuania. And obviously that's another route where they can go. but I think at the moment there is still this feeling of euphoria in the air, that people still believe that change is possible. It's possible to achieve it. And from my conversations, from my own context there, I think everyone is searching for researching the possibilities to leave Belarus, and they're kind of making inquiries and seeing, considering various options, but not many are leaving at the moment. That so far people are thinking that they will wait for 2, 3, 4 months possibly. And then if there is no any positive change, then I think a lot of them will leave. And the last point in the IT sector that I would like to mention is, of course, that the IT have been under also very unprecedented repression. One member of a big IT group, EPAM in Belarus, he's also a member of the coordinating council, and he's the one who was behind the creation of the alternative vote count. Yesterday there were arrests and searches by the KGB in another big startup IT company, PandaDoc, and we have seen solidarity protests yesterday and today. There are several IT, quite high-level CEO IT people who actually were victims of torture in the immediate post-election violence. So all that obviously has a very chilling effect on these people, and I think currently they are torn between leaving and going. But if the situation does not change within the next few months, I fear that many of them will try to relocate.
Well, maybe one final question, Katia. When you look forward over the next couple of months, what do you think will be the key factors that will shape both where the protest movement ends up and also how the Belarusian government responds? What are the key variables that you'll be watching?
Yes, I think we have to watch well, first of all, obviously, we have to watch Russia's reaction and how far it's prepared to support Lukashenko or not, or whether Russia is playing its own game, looking for an alternative candidate through a negotiated transition. Moscow's factor is very important, as we have discussed, and within the next few days, we'll also see what all these visits, and particularly Lukashenko's visits to Moscow, will mean. Obviously, without the support from Russia, I think Lukashenko would have been finished by now. We have to also monitor the protests. We have to, I think, protests will be a big factor. How it will play out in the colder weather with the start of the new year, with the natural fatigue. I think at the moment people are still very keen to come out and take to the streets, but again, with days, it might change. I think we have also to monitor the factor of the opposition, how they will be able to well, of course, unite, but this is secondary. I think, first of all, their priority task is to create a strategy and to work out a plan, how they're going to erode this regime and how they're going to negotiate with the government. And obviously, we have to see what is happening within society. It's more difficult to see that, but there is, already a lot of tension, even in schools. Like school started, many people, many parents feel very ambiguous about that, because on the one hand, they fully, I think, schools quite discredited themselves. On the other hand, I think parents are trying now to restore links with their teachers. They are trying to again approach them in a way to give more support and try to win over the hearts and minds of teachers. So we have to monitor what will be happening in society as well. Of course, we have to look at the regime. At the moment, it looks very monolithic, but a lot will depend on how the economy, of course, will play out in the next few months. And this is something, I think, also one of the very key variables is the economic situation in Belarus.
Well, thank you, Katia. That was a very informative exposition of what's happening in Minsk and more broadly, and we'll be watching these variables very closely, I'm sure, over the coming months as we try to understand how the situation is developing. So thank you very much for joining us again. Appreciate your insight, and thank you everyone else for joining us. Take care.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this discussion. Thank you.